Welcome back to the Word on Fire Institute lecture series, The Idolatry of Identity, Progressive Wokeist Ideology, and the Catholic Response. If mutated forms of classical liberalism, libertarianism, and utilitarianism, and postmodernism compose the fragmented head of the progressive ideological Frankenstein, post-colonial theory comprises its raging heart. These next two lectures will focus on post-colonialism's influence on progressivism. First, by briefly examining its intellectual legacy, which is the subject of this lecture, and then in the subsequent lecture, by showing how progressivism has appropriated this legacy in its anti-racist doctrines, particularly as they are instantiated in the Black Lives Matter, or BLM, political advocacy movement, and the work of self-defined expert in anti-racism, Robin DiAngelo. Post-colonial theory, like postmodern theory, first emerged within an academic context. Its general scope of inquiry is the examination of how Western nations, including the United States, not only physically colonized other regions of the world through coercion and violence, but also more subtly what it calls created the colonized subject. As with postmodernism, the field of post-colonial studies is vast and contains diverse intellectual strands. Yet one name lies at the heart of the theory's substance and spirit: Frantz Fanon. Fanon was a French West Indian psychiatrist and political theorist who wrote extensively about colonial oppression, especially in the French colony of Algeria in northern Africa before its independence in 1962. Fanon's writings are complex, yet they appear to endorse overt physical violence in the name of liberation. He writes at the beginning of his watershed book, The Wretched of the Earth, for example, quote, "National liberation, national reawakening, restoration of the nation to the people or commonwealth, whatever the name used, whatever the latest expression, decolonization is always a violent event." Unquote. It is important to keep this theme of violence in mind when examining post-colonial theory. The reason is because though not all post-colonial theorists endorse violence, the theory's tacit and sometimes explicit support of violence in the name of liberation fundamentally distinguishes post-colonialism from other forms of liberative politics, like those we see in the writings of Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., who, though also struggling against oppression, categorically rejected violence as a means to freedom. Fanon does not fall into that camp. He is not a pacifist. Indeed, perhaps the most unsettling words of the book come not from Fanon, but from the French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who writes in the book's preface, quote, "A single duty, a single objective, drive out colonialism by every means. Those who call for nonviolence would do well to read Fanon. He shows perfectly that this irrepressible violence of the colonized is neither a storm in a teacup, nor the reemergence of savage instincts, nor even a consequence of resentment. It is man reconstructing himself. The colonized are cured of colonial neurosis by driving the colonists out by force. Killing a European is killing two birds with one stone, eliminating in one go oppressor and oppressed." Unquote. In other words, the Fanonian flavor of post-colonialism is seasoned with the belief that the only way to peace in the face of oppression is through violent revolution. In this sense, then, the argument that Fanon makes is not aimed to persuade the colonizers of their wrongdoing or to assemble a moral case for freedom, again, in contradistinction to Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. It is rather a rallying cry to the colonized to unite and war against their oppressors. Now, taken by itself, this willingness to engage in violence in the name of anti-colonial freedom should sound neither foreign nor necessarily immoral, especially to an American audience that grounds its political identity in a war of independence from colonial rule. Yet, as is already evident in Sartre's framing of the struggle for liberation, the most morally significant dimension of Fanon's thought, particularly as it relates to progressive ideology, is how it defines the nature of the oppressors and the nature of the oppressed. For example, to say that Phenon's view of humanity is Manichaean, divided morally and ontologically into good and evil, is not to impose an extrinsic interpretive framework on his writing. It is to employ the very same category he uses to describe the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. Phenom writes, for example, quote, "The colonial world is a Manichaean world. The colonist turns the colonized into a kind of quintessence of evil. Colonized society is not merely portrayed as a society without value. The native is declared impervious to ethics, representing not only the absence of values, but also the negation of values. He is, dare we say, the enemy of values. In other words, absolute evil." Unquote. This is a summation of Phenom's total rejection of both the colonial world and the colonist. The fundamental problem is that they, the colonizers, define us, the colonized, as evil incarnate. The fitting response, however, is not to proclaim a common humanity and seek to break down the wall between oppressor and oppressed. It is rather to reverse the Manichaean polarity, to flip the terms, to make the bad guys the good guys and the good guys the bad guys, which in turn morally justifies the oppressor's complete physical annihilation. As Phenom writes, quote, "To blow the colonial world to smithereens is henceforth a clear image within the grasp and imagination of every colonized subject. To destroy the colonial world means nothing less than demolishing the colonist sector, burying it deep within the earth, or banishing it from the territory." Unquote. It is crucial to highlight that in this struggle for liberation, which Phenom clearly frames not as a battle of ideas, but as the physical eradication of colonizers from a geographic territory, there is, consistent with Manichaean philosophy, no middle ground, no room for dissenting voices, indeed, no room for mercy. You are one of us, or you are one of them. And if you are not with us, you are against us. As Phenom writes, quote, "Everyone must be involved in the struggle for the sake of the common salvation. There are no clean hands, no innocent bystanders. We are all in the process of dirtying our hands in the quagmire of our soil and the terrifying void of our minds. Any bystander is a coward or a traitor." Unquote. The use of religious language here is revealing not only about how Phenom perceives the post-colonial enemy, the oppressors, but also how he views himself and his fellow revolutionaries. To wit, Phenom and his acolytes see the colonized as objects of salvation, and thus themselves as their redeemers. Now, this may sound hyperbolic, but Phenom does not shy away from establishing himself and his fellow African politicians, as he refers to them, as they who must remake the colonized into their own image and likeness, and thereby, quote, humanize them. He writes, for example, quote, "We must elevate the people, expand their minds, equip them, differentiate them, and humanize them," unquote. The colonized, in other words, are not individuals for Phenom. They are not independently thinking subjects who can arrive at their own conclusions using their own inherent rational capacities. They are rather a dehumanized mass, one whose only hope for liberation comes from being humanized by submitting to an enlightened class of rulers who alone know what is good for them. In short, with a hat tip to the classic rock band The Who, we could summarize Phenonian post-colonialism in relation to the colonialism it seeks to overturn as meet the new boss, same as the old boss. As with the previous theories, progressive ideology adopts the major moral and epistemological tenets of post-colonial theory, while once again applying its signature modifications to make the ideology more politically potent. In this case, progressivism makes two alterations to post-colonialism. One, while it preserves the Manichaean distinction between them, evil, and us, good, it generalizes the historically specific conflict between the colonizers and the colonized into an ongoing conflict between the oppressors versus the oppressed. And two, while it preserves the belief that there is an enlightened class of liberators that uniquely holds the true knowledge about the nature of oppression and the way to overcome it, it redefines the criteria for enlightenment from being a university-educated intellectual like Frantz Fanon to simply having the right kind of self-proclaimed lived experience. In the following lecture, we'll examine how these elements of post-colonialism embedded in progressivism help explain the logic, or perhaps better, anti-logic, of the massively influential political advocacy group Black Lives Matter, and the equally influential ideals of anti-racism, particularly as expressed by the self-declared expert on anti-racism author Robin DiAngelo. See you next time.